Okay, welcome to the podcast. My last episode, I didn't get the flack I thought I would. I mean, you do an episode on Gnosticism and the Gospel of Philip, and you expect the legalists to point the finger, but I didn't really get it. But I am going to do the follow-up episode here on Jonathan Edwards that I said I would do because I'm sort of into the topic lately, I guess. So this may not be for everybody. I mean, but I'm really interested in it. And I have been for a long time, so here we go. Literally, everyone on the internet hates Jonathan Edwards, even if they don't know him at all or can't remember where they heard his name. As soon as you remind them, oh, he's like a Puritan revivalist from the 18th century, they just think of him as some, sort of defunct, stodgy Protestant, basically, like irrelevant. And everyone hates that. Hipster atheists think he's, too puritanical, patriarchal, whatever, while tradcaths and ortho bros are dismissive because he doesn't toe their party line. And by the way, stay tuned until the end. I will point out the particularly Protestant problem that arises in all of this, to be fair. But anyway, even mainline Protestants, to the extent that they still exist in America, would disavow Edwards for the most part because he's stuck in the past or something. But I'm here to defend him, and to say that, in fact, he's been a legit influence on my highest thinking because he's one of the least incorrect theologians ever to theologize. The goal of this video is to make Edwards seem strange, almost like a time-traveling guru, a mind that cannot be explained only by studying the relevant historical influences. Now, to get you there, I'm going to force you to listen to something that I know almost all of you are going to hate, and that's because you're poorly educated, racist, wrong, small-minded, and conservative. Listen to this pretty lady for a minute.
And I was shocked at how little I knew about the sutras. And most yoga teachers today don't really know much. They know about the 8 limbs of yoga, but they don't understand the totality of these teachings. So for thousands of years, the practice of yoga was passed down in an oral tradition. One teacher, one student, in sutra form. So a sutra is a condensed nugget of wisdom. So they would memorize these sutras, chant them, and the teacher would expand upon this nugget and reveal the meaning of these sutras. So about 2,300 years ago, a brilliant sage named Patanjali, here's Patanjali. This is how he's depicted. He scribed the Yoga Sutras into 195 sutra format written down in Sanskrit. And basically, the Yoga Sutras is a psychology text mixed with cosmology. So yoga is actually about the mind. This is the source text that states what yoga is and what the practices are to enter into a state of yoga. So yoga is actually about the mind, not the...
Okay, so what in the world does yoga have to do with Jonathan Edwards? I mean, 98% of yoga instructors I've met would never read an 18th century sermon, and if they did, they wouldn't understand it. And 100% of Jonathan Edwards devotees, yes, some few remain, would think that yoga is flat out heretical and has nothing to do with Christianity, let alone Calvinism and Jonathan Edwards. Moreover, even the most self-described perennialists would have a hard time connecting the dots here, simply because, in general, people either tend to read rhetorically dense, late Puritan sermons and theological tracts, or they do yoga poses, light incense, and occasionally flip through pages of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali while they're stoned. But listen, this is what they have in common. The outward, exoteric forms of both traditional, that is non-Americanized, yoga, and the Christian teaching of Jonathan Edwards are teleological means intended to provoke the big thing, which of course is ineffable. And because it's ineffable, it goes by different names in different traditions. Enlightenment, salvation, whatever. Look, you guys, I've become very pro-Catholic over the last couple of years, and I do love the Orthodox. Their beautiful icons, the intense services, their in-group loyalty. None of what I'm going to say here is intended as a diss against any of that stuff. But there are two different ways to do your theologically orthodox religion. You can do it the way the moms at the YMCA do their twice-a-week yoga sessions, with diligence and persistence, but without letting it touch their minds much. You know, show up, endure the homily, eat the Eucharist, and repeat. Or you can do the same things, the same exact things, in the same church, but let those things transform the mind, the soul. If you do it this way, you won't disagree with me that the external forms are at best means to the more important business of soul transforming. And if soul transforming is the highest business, if that's the chief end, if that's the goal, then there might be a little leeway for thinking about which methods, other than the ones you're accustomed to, might provoke the same inward shift. Moreover, you might look around at your church or your YMCA yoga studio and notice week after week people attending, going through the motions, but not really appearing to undergo any profound change. And if you do that, you might wonder if the forms themselves are sort of less than totally effective. I mean, there are plenty of people doing yoga and losing weight or getting physically stronger, but that isn't our chief aim, is it? If what we're doing isn't changing the soul, then maybe running on a treadmill would serve the same purpose. Now, I am not a renowned expert on Edwards. The guy was prolific, and there are scholars who have read everything he ever wrote. That's not me. I took one graduate class in the Puritans, basically. But I am generally apprised of the historical context, and I've read and taught his personal essay, his very influential personal essay, dozens of times. And beyond that, my favorite of his writings is a 1733 sermon, the one I want to focus on here, called, listen to this title, A Divine and Supernatural Light Immediately Imparted to the Soul by the Spirit of God, shown to be both scriptural and rational doctrine. Let's just think about that title a little bit here. A divine and supernatural light. Okay, so let's assume that that's not a redundancy. He's always a very clear, careful writer. That means the light he speaks of is A, divine, and also B, supernatural, which means it's not a natural light, which means it's invisible. And that's interesting because it should cause us to wonder why he calls it a light if it is not a light, or at least not a physical light. I hope to return to this observation later in the podcast when we talk more about ineffableness or ineffability, but parables, talking in images, and so on, that kind of thing, maybe. Next, immediately imparted to the soul by the Spirit of God. Well, in this part of the title, immediately is a word that's a bit too familiar to us now. We should reflect on its etymology. It doesn't mean merely right now, but it means without mediation. You get it? Nothing in between. Welcome, fellow Protestants. Now you see why this is important. That is, a priest isn't giving this to you. Nothing in the external world gives this. This light comes without mediation. This light is imparted, which I think sort of means like given, without mediating causes. I'm reminded of the end of my episode on the Bhagavad Gita, where the claim was that God can be seen, but no sequence of actions can force him to show himself. It's not reading the Vedas, it's not sacrificing, it's not charity, it's not anything else that causes him to be revealed. So this divine and supernatural light comes to us without any mediate causes. I can't be clearer about this. You have to understand this part of the essay. As Edwards himself says, quote, there are not truly any second causes of it, but it is produced by God immediately. That means no prayers, no rituals, no church attending, no Bible reading brings this experience to men, but this light is given to the soul by the Spirit of God. And what a claim this would be if that were all. But Edwards goes further. All this, he says, quote, in the title, shown to be both scriptural and rational. Boom. Wow. Very amazing, right? Yes, this Edwards of 1733 was already trying to answer the challenge put by the early Enlightenment rationalism by producing a theology that could withstand its skeptical inquisition. Look at this. If you're watching on YouTube, look at your screen now. You know who this guy is? This, some of you will recognize, is Emperor Haile Selassie. You ever hear of him? He was that Ethiopian guy who, I don't even know the whole story, basically led some sort of political revolution, right? If you have heard of him, chances are it's in a lyric by Bob Marley. Marley and the Rastafarians literally honor Haile Selassie as a messiah, as a second coming of Jesus. Now, I don't, and I assume that you don't either. But I want you to consider with me for a moment why we don't. Have we investigated the matter? Do we know enough to rule it out? What, is it absurd that Jesus's return would be in Ethiopia instead of Wisconsin? Did Haile Selassie not contact you personally, or did he not do enough miracles? And so that's why we write him off? What criteria do we use to judge the ontological status of human beings? And I'll say one more thing here to clarify what I'm doing. If you're rolling your eyes, if you're so sure you're the type of person, if you're so sure that you're right about this, that you're about to turn this off, well, then I think you're probably not the type of person who would have gone out into the desert by a ditch called the Jordan River and let some bug-eating, half-naked guy dunk you in the ditch while he hollers about the end of the world. And you very likely wouldn't have been among those who believed that the recently killed carpenter from Galilee, of all places, was God. Because, hey, that's preposterous, right? But this is the question that Edwards' essay forces us to consider. How do we recognize this divine light when it is in others? And how can we recognize it if it comes to us? How do we recognize it as true, as legitimate, as authoritative, and not as a delusion, as schizophrenia, or as a manic episode? Sorry, where was I there? Okay, so the essay, sorry, a bunch of kids in my yard too, bugging me, trampling on my new grass. The essay begins, that's a joke, because get on my lawn. The essay that he wrote begins with a text from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 17. It's one that I know Roman Catholics love to cite. It goes like this, quote, "And Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven." For context, Jesus has just asked his disciples who people are saying he is. Rumor is that he's a reincarnated John the Baptist. Others say he's Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. These are bizarre answers, suggesting that belief in reincarnation and transference of souls was pretty widespread at the time. But what about you, Simon Peter? Who do you say I am? Jesus asks. And then Peter says, I say you're the Christ, the Messiah, Son of the living God. And that brings us to our starter verse, where Jesus says, basically, "Good job, Simon, son of Jonah, for you did not recognize me by flesh and blood," that is, by physical, exoteric observations, but God himself told you who I am. So when Jesus came up to these guys at the fishing docks and said, "Follow me," Edwards wants you to really think about that. These disciples did not see a 9-foot tall superhero, a transfigured person, a man glowing with a white aura, or a guy who looks like the guy in the painting at their Methodist church they grew up in. Nothing like that. Rather, they saw a common man like any other. But something told them, this is the guy. This is God's Son, the Messiah, the one we've been waiting for. Was it the way he walked or spoke? Did he do miracles? Nope, it was none of this stuff. The recognition came immediately, and it was given by God directly. And why did these guys recognize Jesus while some others didn't? Well, these were the blessed, the chosen. This is Calvinism, guys. Basically because God said so. This sermon is like, well, first of all, I mean, it's really dense reading. It's also fun if you're into that kind of thing, but it's difficult to read and understand. What you're hearing in my summary is an absolutely expert distillation of its main claims, although as always, I encourage you to check out what I'm saying against your own reading of the text, which is about, like I said, maybe 10 pages long. I do want to give you some idea of how rhetorically intricate Edwards' writing can be. So listen to this paragraph in which he describes how this light of recognition is given without mediation. That is, immediately. Listen up. Quote, God is the author of such knowledge, but yet not so but that flesh and blood reveals it. Mortal men are capable of imparting the knowledge of human arts and the sciences and skill in temporal affairs. God is the author of such knowledge by those means. Flesh and blood is made use of by God as the mediate or second cause of it. He conveys it by the power and influence of natural means. But this spiritual knowledge, spoken of in the text, is what God is the author of, and none else. He reveals it, and flesh and blood reveals it not. He imparts this knowledge immediately, not making use of any intermediate natural causes, as he does in other knowledge. End quote. So yeah, certain sorts of knowledge can be given by mediation, right? I can teach you how to throw a curveball or how to change the oil in your car. So-called flesh and blood can impart that sort of knowledge. But what we're talking about here is a different thing, spiritual knowledge. And God himself is the author of that sort of knowledge. And he alone imparts this knowledge immediately. Like boom, one day you just know. Not because you studied, not because you said the prayers or went to church, you just know. Revelation has come to you. And congratulations when it does, because according to Edwards, this knowledge given by God is the absolute essence of Christian salvation. Nothing could be more important. One of the other really interesting themes Edwards touches on in this essay is the idea of so-called notional understanding of the doctrines of Christian religion. He says numerous times throughout the essay that such an experience of Christianity, that is notional, is insufficient. He says, quote, "This light, and this only, has its fruit in a universal holiness of life. No merely notional or speculative understanding of the doctrines of religion will ever bring to this. But this light, as it reaches the bottom of the heart and changes the nature, so it will effectually dispose to a universal obedience. It shows God's worthiness to be obeyed and served." That is, end quote, that is an amazing thing to say. I mean, that is to say that without this revelation, unless you've had this, it's like, well, I mean, why should I listen to God? But once you get this, it's there. You couldn't imagine arguing the point. It's self-evident at that point. And again, quote, same topic here, quote, there is a difference between having an opinion that God is holy and gracious and having a sense of the loveliness and beauty of that holiness and grace. There is a difference between having a rational judgment that honey is sweet and having a sense of its sweetness. A man may have the former that knows not how honey tastes, but a man can't have the latter unless he has an idea of the taste of honey in his mind. So there is a difference between believing that a person is beautiful and having a sense of his beauty. The former may be obtained by hearsay, but the latter only by seeing the countenance. There is a wide difference between mere speculative, rational judging anything to be excellent and having a sense of its sweetness and beauty. The former rests only in the head. Speculation only is concerned in it, but the heart is concerned in the latter. End quote. There is no conversion, which means no salvation without this sense Edwards is talking about. Again, I remind you of the mind-blowing line near the end of the grueling book of Job. Chapter 42, verse 6 or 7. Quote, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. I pray that you understand this. If you don't, and Edwards is right, you may be the Christian equivalent of a soccer mom doing yoga tapes in her bedroom, while real, awakened, enlightened gurus do actually exist. Before the heresy police come knocking, though, listen to Edwards clarify this point. Quote, this spiritual light is not the suggesting of any new truths or propositions not contained in the Word of God. This suggesting of new truths or doctrines of the mind, independent of any antecedent revelation of those propositions, either in word or writing, is inspiration, such as the prophets and apostles had, and such as some enthusiasts pretend to. But this spiritual light that I am speaking of is quite a different thing from inspiration. It reveals no new doctrine. It suggests no new proposition to the mind. It teaches no new thing of God or Christ or another world, not taught in the Bible, but only gives a due apprehension of those things that are taught in the Word of God. End quote. I suppose this is an important test, and I'm not sure if Haile Selassie passes, measured in this way. But I hope you can sense the urgency of the big question implied in Edwards' essay. Ultimately, the way I frame this, it's about authority. To whom should we listen? Who can we trust? Edwards makes a very strong case that we are forced to judge day after day, and that we are not given physical indicators. We can't merely trust the institutions, the credentials, the titles, even the physiognomy. Even if someone does what appears to be a miracle, remember, it's probably just a magic trick. What is the Protestant problem I mentioned at the beginning? Well, if we take Edwards seriously, and there really are no mediating causes to salvation, then we can't really justify all the amazing art and architecture, the ornate rituals, the incense, music, etc., that we associate with Orthodox forms. It's not that they're bad necessarily, he wouldn't necessarily be against them, but they're unnecessary. They don't teach this spiritual truth, salvation, any more than anything else. God, Edwards believes, can reach us just as easily in a swamp as he can in a cathedral. And indeed, Edwards himself seems to have had his conversion experience in nature, where he often prayed. It would definitely be sad to lose all the beauty associated with the Roman and Eastern institutional traditions. But I gotta say, my own conversion experience culminated in the parking lot outside of a bowling alley. And if there were mediating causes, The causes involved things like Kundalini yoga, walking in the woods, and falling in love. But in fact, I don't think those causes really were mediating. Instead, one day, God just decided to show himself to me for no discernible reason at all. That was in 2007, and I haven't gone a single day since then without thinking about it. What happened was inward, and because it was inward, it was essentially ineffable. But when I read Edwards, and when I read some of the other saints and mystics and so on, I can just tell that he had a similar experience. So one last time, listen to him. Quote, "A true sense of the divine and superlative excellency of the things of religion, a real sense of the excellency of God and Jesus Christ, and of the work of redemption and the ways and works of God revealed in the gospel. There is a divine and superlative glory in these things, an excellency that is of a vastly higher kind and more sublime nature than in other things, a glory greatly distinguishing them from all that is earthly and temporal. He that is spiritually enlightened truly apprehends and sees it, or has a sense of it. He doesn't merely rationally believe that God is glorious, but he has a sense of the gloriousness of God in his heart. There's not only a rational belief that God is holy and that holiness is a good thing, but there is a sense of the loveliness of God's holiness. There is not only a speculatively judging that God is gracious, but a sense how amiable God is upon that account, or a sense of the beauty of this divine attribute." End quote. Salvation isn't a true-false quiz, guys. If I could give you this inward sense somehow, of course I would. But the rules are only God himself can give it. The supernatural light is called a light because it enlightens. But even that is a metaphor, of course. We have to conclude in this territory, conquered again by the ineffableness of ultimate reality. You know what? I lied. One last time, a half paragraph from Edwards, and then I won't even comment. This episode is over after I read this, so do the thing with Patreon, and tell your friends. Oh, and leave comments, because apparently that helps the algorithm too. Thanks. Anyway, here it is. This is from Jonathan Edwards' personal narrative, which became like almost a template for conversion narratives over the century that would follow. Listen to what he says. "Once, as I rode out into the woods for my health in 1737, having alighted from my horse in a retired place, as my manner commonly has been, to walk for divine contemplation and prayer, I had a view that for me was extraordinary of the glory of the Son of God as mediator between God and man, and his wonderful, great, full, pure and sweet grace and love, and meek and gentle condescension. This grace that appeared so calm and sweet appeared also great above the heavens. The person of Christ appeared ineffably excellent, with an excellency great enough to swallow up all thought and conception, which continued, as near as I can judge, about an hour, which kept me the greater part of the time in a flood of tears and weeping aloud. I felt an ardency of soul to be, what I know not otherwise how to express, emptied and annihilated, to lie in the dust, and to be full of Christ alone, to love him with a holy and pure love, to trust in him, to live upon him, to serve and follow him, and to be perfectly sanctified and made pure with a divine and heavenly purity. End quote. See you next time.